External analysis of performance data refers to fitting ideal points based on preference data to stimulus space developed from similarities data obtained from the same subject. For example, we might scale similarities data individually, examining the individually map for commonality of perceptions and the scale the preference data for any group identified in the function. In this procedure is followed, the research must gather both preferences and similarities data to achieve external analysis. Premap was developed slowly to perform external analysis or preference data. B ensures the similarities matrix define the objects in the perpetual map. The research can now identify both attributes descriptors, assuming that the perpetual space is the same as the evaluative discriminations, and ideal points for individual premap provides estimate for the number of different type of idea points, each based on different assumption as to nature or preferences, versus point presentation or equal versus differential dimension weight. Choosing between internal and external analysis, it is generally concepted that external analysis is clearly preferable to internal analysis. This conclusion is based on conceptual difficulties with internal analysis procedure and on the confounding differences in the preference with differences in perception. In addition, the silences of perceived dimensions may change as one moves from perpetual space. Are the similarity and dissimilarities to evaluate space? Which stimulus is preferred? We discussed the procedure of external examination in our example of perpetual mapping with multidimensional scaling at the end of this chapter. Let's talk about point versus vector presentations. The discussion of perpetual mapping or preferences data emphasize an ideal point that portray the relationship of an individual preferences ordering for the set of the stimuli. The previous section of discuss the issue relating to the type of data and analysis is estimated and placing the ideal point. The remaining issues focus on the manner in which the other object in the perpetual map related to the ideal point to reflect preferences. The two approaches, point versus vector presentations, are discussed next. Point representation, the most easily understood method of portraying the ideal point, is to the straight line distance measure of preference ordering from the ideal point to the points representing the objective. We are assuming that the direction of distance from the ideal points is not critical, the relative distance. An example shown in figure 9. Here, the ideal point as positions indicates that the most preferred of the following by C and B, D, and finally A, the ordering of the preferences is directly related to the distance from the ideal point. Vector representation. The ideal point can also be shown as vector to calculate the preferences in the approach. Perpendicular lines, also known as projection, are drawn from the object to the vector. Preferences increases in the direction the vector is pointing the preferences and the redirect from the order of the projections. Figure 10 illustrates the vector approaches for two subjects with the same set of stimuli propositions. For subject 1, the vector has the directions of lower preferences in the bottom left hand corner, the higher preferences in the upper right and the corner. When the projection of each object made preferences offer high to lowest is A, B, C, D and D. However, the same object have a quite differences preferences order for subject 2. For subject 2, the preferences order range from the most preferred E to least preferred C. In this manner, a separate vector can represent each subject. The vector approach does not provide a single ideal point, but it is assumed that the ideal point is an infinite distance outward on the vector. This is the multi-dimensional scaling, which has multiple dimensions. Dimension 1, dimension 2, A, B, C, D. Here are the interface. Is preferences counter. Multi-dimension scaling, dimension second, preference order highest and lowest. C greater than B, B greater than D, D greater than E. So C greater than B, B greater than D, D greater than A. Points representation of an ideal point. These are the representation subject 1, dimension second, subject 2. Although either the point of vector and representation can indicate that combination of attributes are more preferred, these observations are often not borne out by further experiment. For example, Remonde cite an example in which the conclusion was drawn the people would prefer brownies on the basis of the degree or moistures and the chocolate content. When the food technicians applied this laboratory, they found that their brownies made to the experimental specification. Because chocolate milk, one cannot always assume that the relationship found are independent or linear, or that they hold over the time. As noted previously, however, multidimensional scaling is a beginning in the understanding, perception and choice that will explain considerably as application extended and knowledge of both the methodology and human perception. Stage 5, integrating the multidimensional scaling results. Once the perpetual map is obtained, the two approaches, conceptuals and decompositionals, against diverge in their interpretation of the results. The differences in the interpretation are based on the amount of information directly provided in the analysis. For example, the attributes incorporated in the compositions analysis versus their absence in the decompositional analysis, and the generalizability of the result to the actual decision making process. For composition method, the perpetual map can be directly interpreted with the attributes incorporated in the analysis. The solution, however, must be valid and against other the measurement of the perceptions, because of the position are totally defined by the attribute special by the researcher. For example, discriminant analysis result might be applied to a new set of the objective or respondent, assessing the ability to the differentiate with these new observations. For decompositional method, the most important issue is the description of the perpetual dimension and the correspondence to attribute. Evaluation or similarities or preference are done without the regard to attributes, those avoiding the specification error issues. The risk, however, is that the perpetual dimensions are not correctly translated in the dimensions used in the evaluation are not reflected by the attributes to their interpretation. Descriptive technique, a label to dimensions as well as the integrated preferences for objective and attributes. With the similarities judgment and the discussed later, again in the line with the objective, the decompositional method provide an initial look into the perception from the which more formalized perspective may emerge. The remainder of the chapter focus on decompositional method, primarily the various techniques used in multidimensional scaling. A notable perception is the discuss of the composite approach, correspondence analysis that to degree bright to gap between the two approaches in the flexible method interpretation. Identifying the dimensions. As discussed in the interpretation factor, in fact, factor analysis, identifying underlying dimensions is often a difficult task. Multidimensional scaling technique have now built in the procedure for labeling the dimensions. The research having developed the map with the select dimensionality can adopted procedure, either the subjective or objective. Subjective procedures interpretation must always include some element of the research or respondent judgment, and in many cases, this level of judgment proves adequate for the questions at hand. A quite simple yet effective method is labeling by visual inspections the dimension of the perpetual map by the respondent. Respondent may be asked to interpret the dimensionality subjective by inspecting the map, or the set of the expert may evaluate and identify the dimensions, although it make no attempt to quantitatively link the dimensions to attribute. This approach may be the best available if the dimensions are believed to be highly interchangeable or affective or emotional in the content, so that adequate description cannot be devised. In a similar manner, the researcher may describe the dimension in the term of non-objective characteristic. In this way, the correspondence is made between the objective and perpetual dimension directly, although these relationships are not a result of respondent feedback but of the research judgment. Objective procedure. As a complement to the subjective procedure, a number of more formalized methods have been developed. The most widely used method, profit proprietary, collect attribute rating for each objective and finds the best correspondent of each attribute to the derived perpetual space. The attempt is to identify the determinants attribute in the similarity judgment made by the individuals. Measures of fit are given for each attribute as well as their correspondence with the dimensions. The researcher can then determine which attributes best desire the perpetual positions and are illustrative of the dimensions. The need for correspondence between the attributes and the dimensions with use of metric output because of the dimension can be rotated freely without any chances in interpretation. Selecting between the subjective and objective procedures. For either subjective or objective procedure, the researcher must remember that although a dimension can represent a single attribute, it usually does not. A more common procedure is to collect data on several attributes associated with either the subjectively or empirically with the dimension where applicable, and the determined label for each dimension using the multiple attributes similar to the factor analysis. Many researchers suggest that using attribute data to help label the dimension is the best alternative. The problem, however, is that the research may not include all the important attributes in this study. Thus, the researcher can never be totally assured that the label represent all relevant attributes. Both subjective and objective procedure illustrate the difficulty of labeling and access. This task is essential because the dimensional labels are required for further interpretation and use of the results. The researcher must select the type of the procedure that best suits for both an objective or the research and the available information. Thus, the research must plan for the derivations of the dimensional label as well as the estimation of the perpetual map. Let's talk about the stage 6, that is the validating the MDS results. We call it multidimensional scaling. Validation in multidimensional scaling is an important as in any other multivariate technique because of highly interferential nature of multidimensional scale. This effort should be directed towards ensuring the generalizability of the result but across the objective and the population, as we'll see in the following Discussion. Multidimensional scaling represent a particularly problematic issues in validation, both from the subjective as well as the method perspective. Issue in a validation. Any multidimensional scaling solution must deal with two specified issues that complicate effort to validate the result. The only output of multidimensional scaling that can be used for comparative purpose involve the relative positions of the objective. Those, although the position can be compared, the underlying dimension have not bias for comparison. If the position vary, the researcher cannot determine whether the objective are viewed differently. The perpetual dimensions vary of both. Systematic method of the comparison have not been developed and integrated into the statistical program. The researcher is left to improve with the procedure that may address general concern but are not specified to multidimensional scaling. As a result, researchers strive in their validation efforts to maintain comparability between the solution while providing the empirical basis for comparison. Let's talk about approaches validation. Any approaches to validation attempts to assess generalizability, for example, similarity across different samples while maintaining comparability for comparison purpose. This issue discussed in the previous section, however, make this requirement difficult for any multidimensional solution. Several approaches for validations that meet each requirement to some degree and discussed next. Split sample analysis. The most direct validation approach is a split or multidimensional comparison in which either the original sample is divided or new sample is collected. In either instances, the researcher must then find a means of comparing the result. Most often the comparison between the result is done visually or with the simple correlation of coordinates. Some machine program are available such as FatMatch, but in the research still must determine how many of the disparities are due to differentiate in the object perceptions, differing dimensions, or both. Comparison of decompositional versus decompositional solution. Another approach is to obtain a convergent of multidimensional scaling by applying both decompositional and compositional method to the same sample. The decomposition method could be applied first along with the interpretation of the dimensions to identify key attribute, then one of more compositional method, particularly correspondent analysis, could be applied to confirm the result. The researcher must realize that this is not true validation of the result in terms of generalizability, but does not confirm the interpretation of the dimension from the validation effort with other sample, and other objective could be undertaken to demonstrate the generalizability to other sample. Overview of the multidimensional scaling. Multidimensional scaling represents a distinct approach to multivariate analysis when compared to other methods in this text, whereas other techniques are concerned with accurately specify the attribute comparison independent and the dependent variable. Multidimensional scaling take a quite different approach. It's gather only global or holistic measurement of the similarities or performance and the quite different approaches. It gather only global or holistic measurement of the similarities or preferences than empirical. Interface the dimensions, both character and the number. They reflect the best explanations of the individual responses, either the separate or collectively. In this approach, the variate used in Many other techniques become the perpetual dimensions interpret from the analysis. As such, the researcher does not have be conducted with such issues as specification error, multicollinearity. Driving and validation of the multi-dimensional scaling solution. Stresses measured lower values are better represent and multidimensional solution fit. Researcher can identify a degenerate multidimensional solutions that is generated problematic by the looking for a crucial pattern of the objective, suggesting that the all objects are equally similar, or a multi-clustered solution in which objects are grouped of two ends of the single continuum. The approach's number of the dimensions for the perpetual map is based on a subjective judgment as to whether the solution with the given dimension is reasonable. Use of the screen plot to identify the elbow where the substantial improvement in the fit occurs. Use of R2 as an index of fit measures of 0.6 or higher are considered acceptable. External analysis such as the performed by the pre-map is considered preferable in generating ideal points relative to internal analysis. The most direct validations method is a split sample approach. Multiple solutions are generated by either the splitting the original sample or collecting the new data. Validity is indicated when the multiple solutions match. Or statistical characteristic of the variables. The challenging to the research, however, is to interpret and vary it without the valid interpretation to primary objective or multidimensional scale are compromised. The application of multidimensional scaling is appropriate when the objective is more oriented towards understanding overall preferences or pre- prepare perceptions rather than the detailed perspective involving attributes. One technique, however, combines the specify or attributes level analysis within the multidimensional scaling like solution. That method correspondence analysis is discussed in the following section, where the similarities and differences with the traditional multidimensional scaling technique are highlighted. An illustration of the multidimensional scaling. To demonstrate the use of multidimensional technique, we examine data gathered in the series of the T views to company representative of the cross section of the potential customers. The discussion will proceed by the following the 6-step procedure. Step earlier, the example discussed here to compare by the comparison technique of the correspondent analysis. Readers are encouraged to review the technique as well. The application of both compositional and decompositional technique enable the researcher to gain unique insight from the each technique while also established a comparison between the each method. Data set of both technique are available on the web. This objective multidimensional scaling, a common use of the perpetual mapping is the explain the firm image and competitiveness. This include addressing the perceptions of the set of the firm, the market, as well as the investigating attributes underlying those firm position in automation. Regarding preferences among the potential customers can be added to the analysis and desire in the example, but use perpetual mapping technique to identify the position of but in a perpetual map of measure competition in the market with the understanding of the dimensions comparison used by the potential customer in the analysis those market position to identify the relative attribute that contribute the position as well as those of the competitors. Particular interest is focused on the assessing the dimensions of evaluation that may too subjective and effective to be measured by the conventional scale. Moreover, the intent to the create of the single overall perpetual map combining the position of the objective and subjective and making the relative position of objective and consumer for segmentation analysis such more direct and achieving this objective the research must address their fundamental issues that the character of the result the object to be considered for comparison, the use of similarities and the preferences data, and the use of the disaggregate or aggregate analysis, each of the use of the following discussion. Identifying objective from inclusion. A critical discussion for any perpetual mapping analysis is the selections of the object to the compared, given the judgment and made based on the similarities of the objective. Another, the inclusion of the exclude the objective can be made of the market impact, for example, including a firm and distinguished characteristics unique to be firm and help to reveal firm to firm comparison or even the dimensions.